The water had frozen overnight. Agnes knew before she plunged her hands in. The surface of the stone trough held a skin of ice, pale and opaque in the pre-dawn dark, and she broke it with the heel of her palm, the way she broke every morning, without ceremony, without hesitation, because hesitation was a luxury that belonged to women who had not already lost an hour's work to it. The cold entered her hands like a blade, not sharp, not sudden. The particular deep cold of water that has been sitting in stone all night, the kind that does not sting so much as consume, working inward from the knuckles until her fingers stopped being fingers and became something she directed from a distance, instruments she could observe but no longer quite feel. She scrubbed. The pot in her hands was last night's soup vessel, iron, heavy, the residue of boiled turnip and salt water baked to the bottom in a dark crust. She worked the brush in circles. The rhythm was the only thing keeping her upright. Circular, circular, the bristles dragging across iron, the sound of it filling the yard behind the Graymore kitchens where no one else was awake yet, and the sky was the color of a bruise healing badly. Across the yard, a lamp burned in the kitchen window. Edwin's silhouette moved behind the glass. She could see the shape of him. Too thin, the shoulders not yet filled out. The particular angular quality of a boy who had been growing faster than she could feed him. He was stoking the ovens. He had been awake before her, which meant he had not slept well, which meant the cough was back, which meant she needed to find a way to get him something warm before the morning shift began. She scrubbed faster. The sooner she finished the pots, the sooner she could collect the day's bread ration from the kitchen stores. 1 loaf, for both of them. Lord Cresswell's accounts were precise on this point. 1 loaf per pair of kitchen workers sharing a billet. The calculation made by a man whose own breakfast arrived on a silver tray, and who had never, in 12 years of managing Graymore Hall's accounts, gone to bed with less than he needed. She had not eaten since yesterday's midday portion. She did not think about it. Thinking about hunger made it louder, gave it edges and a voice, and she had learned long ago that the only way to carry something that heavy was to refuse to look directly at it. The last pot came out of the water gray and steaming faintly in the cold air. She set it on the stone beside the trough and sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She held them out in front of her, red to the wrists, the skin at the knuckles so thin it had gone translucent. The splits from yesterday's work opened again by the cold and weeping in the way that cracked skin weeps, not blood exactly, just the body's slow protest against what it is being asked to endure. She pressed them flat against the stone trough. The cold was familiar. The cold had edges she knew. She held them there until the trembling became something she could carry rather than something carrying her. Until her breathing steadied and the yard stopped tilting and she was simply Agnes Whitmore, scullery maid, 26 years old, with a morning's work behind her and a day's work ahead. She stood. Edwin appeared at the kitchen door with the bread wrapped in cloth, his breath making small clouds in the cold. He held it out without meeting her eyes. He had learned not to make it a conversation, because conversations about the bread always ended the same way. She broke it in half, gave him the larger piece. "Agnes, you always eat." He ate. She watched him eat. The particular focused attention of someone cataloging a resource being correctly deployed, and when he had finished half of his portion and tucked the rest in his jacket for later, she wrapped her own half in her apron and did not touch it. She would eat tonight, after her shift, if there was nothing else to spend it on. There was always something else to spend it on. Lord Cresswell had raised the kitchen workers' debt levy again last month, a quiet adjustment, a line in the accounts that Edwin had not seen because Agnes had made certain he had not seen it. The number had a particular quality that she had learned to recognize, the kind of number that was not a mistake. She picked up the empty pail and went back to work. The stable assignment came in the afternoon, delivered by the underfootman with the apologetic efficiency of someone passing along bad news that was not his fault. "Stable floors," he said, added to her duties. No adjustment to her wage, naturally. Lord Cresswell's accounts were precise on that point as well. Agnes took the pail and the brush and went. The stable was dark and cold, and smelled of hay and horse, and the particular damp that settles into old stone when it has been cold for too many winters in a row. She set the pail down at the entrance and let her eyes adjust. The horses shifted in their stalls, 3 of them, the estate's working animals, their breath making slow clouds in the dim air. She knelt and began to scrub. A sound from the far stall, not a horse sound. She stopped. A man was sitting in the hay against the wall. Ragged clothes, a coat that had once been brown and was now the color of everything that has been rained on too many times, trousers patched at both knees, boots that had separated at the left sole and been tied back with a strip of leather. Thin face, dark hair. Hands curled in his lap, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He was watching her with amber eyes. The temperature in the stable had dropped. She had not noticed it until now, standing still, the brush dripping in her hand. The horses were very quiet. All 3 of them, heads turned toward the far stall, ears forward, not frightened exactly, something more like attention. The focused stillness of animals in the presence of something they cannot categorize. "Are you from the village?" she said. "I am from nowhere in particular." His voice was low, deliberately plain, the vowels careful in the way of someone choosing simplicity. "I asked the stable master if I could shelter here for the night. He said no one would notice." Agnes looked at him. His lips were pale. His clothes were damp at the shoulders. He was not shaking. And then, a moment later, he was, a small, careful tremor that she noticed because she had spent 18 years watching Edwin for signs of cold and hunger, and knew what genuine shivering looked like. She reached into her apron. The half-loaf was still there, wrapped in cloth, untouched since morning. She took it out, tore it in 2, held out the larger piece. He looked at it, then at her face. "I cannot take your food. It is bread, not a fortune." She kept her arm extended. "Take it, or we both sit here hungry, and neither of us is better for it." He took it. His fingers brushed hers as he did. They were cold, not the cold of the stable, not the cold of the morning water, but something deeper and older, the kind of cold that does not come from weather or stone or winter air, the kind of cold that has been there a very long time. She noticed. She did not remark on it. She knelt and went back to scrubbing. The brush moved in circles across the stable floor, circular, circular, the familiar rhythm, the sound of bristles on stone filling the silence between them. He ate. She worked. The horses settled. After a while he said, "You do not have enough for yourself. Why did you share it?" She did not look up. "Because you had less." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him watching her hands, the cracked knuckles, the reddened skin, the way the brush moved with the mechanical precision of someone who has been doing this long enough that the body knows it without being asked. She finished the floor, stood, picked up the pail. At the stable door, she turned back. He was sitting in the hay with the bread in his hands, looking at it with an expression she could not name. Not gratitude exactly. Something older and less comfortable than gratitude. The look of a man encountering something he had forgotten existed. "There is a blanket on the third hook," she said. "The stable master will not miss it." She left. The door swung shut behind her, and the stable returned to dark. The man who called himself Thomas sat in the hay with a half-loaf of bread in his hands and did not move. The shadows at his feet gathered and stilled. The horses breathed. Outside, the sound of Agnes's footsteps crossed the yard and faded toward the kitchen door. And then there was only the wind against the stable walls and the small sounds of the estate settling into evening. He looked down at his wrist. Beneath the beggar's coat, beneath the rough linen sleeve, the ancient seal of the vampire king pulsed once, a single beat of warmth, slow and deep, like an ember that has been cold for 4 centuries, suddenly remembering what fire felt like. He had not felt it in 400 years. He sat very still. The shadows gathered at his feet and did not move. His hands had stopped performing the cold. The bread sat in his palms, real and plain and warm from where she had carried it against her body all day. And he held it with a stillness that was not gratitude but something older, the recognition of a debt he had not yet learned to name, stirring in a place he had believed long since emptied. He did not move. He did not yet know what to call it. The broth had gone cold by the time she reached the stable door. Agnes had carried it from the kitchen wrapped in her apron, the cup pressed against her ribs for warmth, moving through the yard with her eyes on the ground and her shoulders drawn in and her footsteps making no sound on the frost-hardened earth. The sky was still dark. The estate had not yet woken. She pushed the door open. He was sitting where she had left him, not sleeping, not resting, simply sitting, his back against the wall, his hands curled in his lap, his amber eyes finding her at the door before she had crossed the threshold, before she had made a sound, before the horses had shifted, before there was any reasonable way he should have known she was there. The temperature dropped as she stepped inside. She set the cup on the hay bale nearest to him and did not sit. The horses were quiet. The shadows in the far corner of the stable were thicker than they should have been, given the lantern she had left burning on the hook, but she did not look at them directly. "You are still here," she said. "I have nowhere pressing to be." She looked at his hands. They were too still. Not the stillness of cold or exhaustion. She knew what those looked like, had catalogued every variation of them on Edwin's body for years. This was something else. The stillness of someone accustomed to directing rather than receiving, to holding rather than being held. A man who had forgotten how to be given something. He lifted the cup, drank. "There is work in the village if you can carry," she said. "The miller needs someone. I prefer to observe before I commit." She almost smiled. Almost. That is a luxury. Most of us commit first and observe the consequences. He said nothing. His eyes followed her as she moved to check the horse's water, the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, rather than something he is simply looking at. She did not remark on it. She left. The yard was gray and still, the frost making the cobblestones treacherous near the kitchen steps. She moved carefully, the empty cup in her hand, and was nearly to the door when she saw Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper was standing in the corridor just inside the kitchen entrance, arms folded, her dark dress immaculate, her expression the particular variety of neutral that Agnes had learned to read as anything but. She looked at Agnes, at the cup, at Agnes again. "Whitmore," Mrs. Pemberton's voice was even. "You are short one portion from the kitchen stock this morning." Agnes kept her face still. "I spilled it." "You have never spilled anything in 3 years of service." The silence between them had weight. Agnes held the cup against her apron and did not look away, because looking away would be worse than holding the woman's gaze and letting her see whatever she was going to see. Mrs. Pemberton unfolded her arms. She adjusted the chatelaine at her waist. A small, precise movement. The kind she made when she was deciding something. "Be more careful with what you carry, girl." A pause. "Lord Cresswell counts every drop in this house." She walked away down the corridor, her keys making their familiar sound against her hip, and did not look back. Agnes stood in the doorway and breathed. 3 days passed. She brought what she could. Skimmed portions from the bottom of the soup pot, bread ends that would otherwise be thrown to the yard birds, a heel of cheese she had been saving for Edwin, but that Edwin had not asked about. She told herself it was practical. She told herself the man in the stable was a problem that would resolve itself when the weather broke and he moved on, and that until then the sensible thing was to keep him fed enough to stay quiet and unnoticed. She told herself this each morning and did not examine it closely. Thomas listened. That was the thing she had not expected. He did not fill the silence with complaints or gratitude, or the particular desperate conversation of men who had been alone too long. He asked questions, careful ones, spaced between long silences, delivered in that deliberately plain voice that she had begun to notice was slightly too controlled, the vowels too considered, the pauses too precise. "Who manages the estate accounts?" he asked on the second morning, while she scrubbed the stable floor and he sat with his back against the wall. "Lord Cresswell." She worked the brush in circles. "Has done for 12 years. "And the rents?" "Collected quarterly. Kitchen workers owe a portion of their wage as lodging debt." She wrung the cloth. "The figure has increased twice in 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. "And the master of the estate permits this?" She sat back on her heels. "The master of this estate is a shadow, a name on a deed." She looked at the floor, not at him. "No one has seen Lord Vane in months, perhaps longer." "What manner of man is he?" The question landed oddly. She picked up the brush again. "I would not know. I have never been permitted above the kitchen level." She paused. The bristles moved. "They say he is old. They say the house is cold because of him. They say the shadows move differently when he is in residence." "And what do you say?" She wrung the cloth again, harder than necessary. "I say that a master who allows Lord Cresswell to double the debts of people who cannot pay them is either complicit or absent, and I am not certain which is worse." The words fell into the stable like stones into still water. Thomas did not respond. She looked up. His amber eyes had shifted, just for a moment, a flicker of something darker moving through them like a current beneath ice, and the temperature in the stable dropped 2 degrees in the space of a breath. She noticed. She did not remark on it. Lord Cresswell came to the kitchen on the 3rd afternoon. Agnes heard him before she saw him. The particular quality of silence that preceded him. The way the other kitchen workers found reasons to look at their hands or their work or the wall. The way the room reorganized itself around his presence without anyone appearing to move. He was smiling. He held a ledger. His hands were clean, not merely washed but manicured. The nails pale and even. The hands of a man whose labor was performed entirely by others. He did not look at Agnes. He looked at the ledger. Whitmore. She kept her hands in the wash basin. The water was gray and cold and still. Your kitchen debt has been recalculated. He turned a page. The motion was unhurried. The new monthly figure is double the previous amount, effective immediately. Another page. Additionally, there is the matter of missing stock, broth, bread, candle ends, reported over the past week. The cost has been added to your account. Agnes's hands stopped moving. The water was very still around them. I have not taken anything, my lord. The accounts suggest otherwise. He closed the ledger. The snap of it was very loud in the quiet kitchen. If the balance is not settled by quarter's end, your brother's position will be reviewed. He left. His footsteps receded down the corridor, unhurried, the particular pace of a man who has never needed to hurry because the consequences always arrived on schedule without him. Agnes stood at the basin. The water was gray. Her hands were beneath it, and she could not feel them, and she did not move. Behind her, she heard Edwin set something down on the work table, a pot, carefully, the sound of someone trying not to make noise. Agnes, go back to your station. Her voice did not break. It came out level and flat, and entirely without inflection. The voice she used when she needed to hold something in place by sheer force of not acknowledging it. Edwin was quiet for a moment. She heard him pick up the pot again. She pressed her hands flat against the bottom of the basin and held them there. The water was very cold. She found a pot near the basin's edge, iron encrusted at the rim, and she pulled it toward her and began to scrub. Circular, the brush moving in circles, the sound of bristles on iron filling the space where her breathing was trying to become something she could not afford. She scrubbed until the trembling in her hands became something she could carry rather than something carrying her, until the kitchen sounds returned around her, and the room was just a room again, and she was just Agnes Whitmore, scullery maid, with a debt she had not made and a brother she could not afford to lose. She did not go to the stable that evening. She went at night. She had nothing to bring. That was the thing she kept arriving at, turning over in her mind during the hours between Cresswell's departure and the moment the kitchen finally went dark. She had nothing to bring. No bread, no broth, no scraps diverted from anything, because every portion she had was now accounted for and doubled and held against her in a ledger she had never been permitted to read. She went anyway. The stable was dark. She did not bring the lantern. She felt her way to the wall and sat down on the floor, her back against the wood, her knees drawn up, her hands pressed flat on the cold stone. She was not scrubbing. She was not folding. She was simply sitting in the dark, which was something she almost never allowed herself. Thomas was there. She could feel the cold of him before her eyes adjusted, the particular deep cold that had nothing to do with the stable or the December air. He did not speak immediately. The space between them was careful and deliberate, 2 feet of hay-scattered stone, a distance that felt chosen rather than accidental. Tell me about Cresswell, he said. There is nothing to tell that you cannot see. Her voice was quiet, flat. He owns the debt. He owns the kitchen. He owns whether my brother eats or works or stays. And the master of this house permits it? She turned her head toward the wall. The master of this house is a shadow, a name on a deed. A pause. People like me do not have masters, Thomas. We have circumstances. She turned her head toward him then. Her eyes were dry. She had made certain of that before she came. Why do you ask so many questions about things that do not concern a beggar? He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and in the silence she became aware, slowly, of the shadows at his feet. She had noticed them before, the way the dark gathered around him more thickly than it should, the way the corners of the stable seemed to lean toward him rather than away. She had filed it under the category of things she did not have time to examine. Now, sitting still in the dark with nothing else to look at, she looked. They were not normal shadows. They had weight. They moved with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the lantern she had not brought, or the wind against the stable walls. They pooled at his feet and spread slowly outward, and they were darker than the dark around them, and they were gathered the way water gathers in the lowest place, not randomly, but because something was drawing them there. She stood. He stood. He moved without sound. She had not seen him rise. He was simply standing, and his amber eyes caught no light from anywhere, and the shadows at his feet were very still and very dark and very deliberate. Because a beggar with nothing to lose, he said, can ask questions that a king cannot. The words hung in the air between them. Agnes backed toward the door. Her hand found the latch. Cold iron, solid, real. She did not break eye contact. The cold of him was everywhere now, not just the air but the stone beneath her feet, the wood at her back, the latch beneath her palm. You are not what you seem, Thomas. His expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. Something very old and very still, like a door that has been closed for a long time shifting on its hinges. Neither are you, Agnes Whitmore. She opened the door. The December air came in hard and cold and clean, and she stepped through it, and the door swung shut behind her, and she walked across the yard without looking back, her footsteps silent on the frost, her hands pressed flat against her sides. In the stable, Thomas stood in the dark. The door was closed. Her words were still in the air. Not what you seem, not what you seem. And the shadows at his feet were gathered thick and heavy and entirely without pretense now, because there was no one left to perform stillness for. He looked down at his wrist. The seal burned, not the faint pulse of recognition he had felt when she first pressed bread into his hands, not the slow warmth of an ember remembering fire. This was something older and more insistent, a heat that moved through the ancient mark like a current through iron, steady and deep and entirely without mercy, the way a thing burns when it has been cold for 400 years and has finally, without warning, been given a reason to remember warmth. He did not move. The shadows held their position. The horses breathed. Outside, the sound of Agnes's footsteps crossed the yard and faded, and then there was only the wind against the stable walls and the burning at his wrist, and the particular quality of silence that follows a door closing on something that cannot be taken back. He stood very still in the dark. He did not yet know what morning would bring her. He knew what Cresswell would bring. Morning came without mercy. The servants' hall filled before Agnes reached it. Word moved faster than feet in a house like Graymore, and by the time Lord Cresswell's summons had passed through the kitchen and the laundry and the upper corridor, every member of the household staff had found a reason to be present. They stood along the walls in their stations, footmen near the door, kitchen maids in a cluster by the cold hearth, the laundress with her red hands folded at her waist. 40 people in a room built for 20, and all of them very carefully not looking at Agnes as she was brought in. Lord Cresswell stood at the head of the long table. His ledger was open. His hands rested on either side of it. Clean, manicured, entirely still. He did not look up when she entered. Whitmore. He let the name sit in the air for a moment before he continued. Kitchen stock, estate provisions, unauthorized distribution of goods belonging to Graymore Hall. He turned a page. The sound of it was very deliberate. The accounts are quite specific. Agnes kept her hands at her sides. The knuckles were cracked from yesterday's scrubbing. The skin split at the first joint of her right hand. And the cold of the hall was working into the wound with patient efficiency. She did not reach for her apron. She had not worn it. She had known, when the summons came, that this was not a kitchen matter. I gave my own ration, she said. The broth was my portion. The bread was mine. The accounts disagree, Whitmore. Then the accounts are wrong. A small sound moved through the assembled servants. Not quite a breath. The particular silence of people who know better than to react. Lord Cresswell smiled. The compression of his mouth that never reached his eyes. The accounts, he said, are never wrong. That is rather the point of keeping them. He closed the ledger with one clean motion. The penalty for theft at Graymore Hall is dismissal without reference. For the guilty party. He paused. And for her dependents. He looked toward the back of the room. Edwin was standing near the door. He was 17 years old, and he had his mother's jaw and his father's eyes, and he was looking at Agnes with an expression she recognized, because she had worn it herself at 8 years old, the night their parents did not come home. The expression of someone who has just understood that the ground is not solid. Agnes's hands clenched. He has done nothing, she said. Her voice was level. She made it level. Whatever you intend for me, Edwin is not part of it. Employment at Graymore Hall is contingent on the good conduct of all household members. Lord Cresswell adjusted the ledger's position on the table by a quarter inch. I do not make the rules, Whitmore. I merely administer them. You made these ones. The smile again, wider this time. The temperature dropped. It happened between one breath and the next. A cold that had nothing to do with December or stone walls or the unlit hearth. Every candle in the room guttered simultaneously, the flames pulling sideways as though something had moved through the air at speed, and then steadying, and then dimming to half their height. The shadows along the walls surged. They gathered at the doorway with the purposeful weight of water finding its level. The ledger slipped from Lord Cresswell's hands. Lord Raphael Vane stood in the doorway of the servants' hall. He was not wearing Thomas's rough coat. He was not wearing the hollow-faced performance of hunger she had pressed bread into for 7 days. He wore dark, formal clothes, precise and unadorned, and he stood with the particular stillness of something that has been alive long enough to know that stillness is its own authority. His eyes were fully, unmistakably crimson. He said one word. Cresswell. The room did not move. 40 people, and not one of them breathed. Agnes looked at his hands. Cold hands. She had felt them close around bread in the dark of the stable, careful and deliberate, with that quality of stillness she had not been able to name. She looked at his eyes. Amber eyes that shifted to crimson under duress. She understood now. Amber eyes that had watched her from the shadows of a stall, while she told him that people like her did not have masters. She had told him the master of this house was a shadow, a name on a deed. She had told him that to his face. You lied to me. Her voice came out level. She had not planned it to be level. Her hands were shaking, and her voice was level, and those two things existed in her body at the same time without resolution. 7 days. Every morning. You lied to me. He looked at her. The crimson eyes did not flinch. Yes, he said. Nothing else. No justification. No architecture of explanation built to soften it. Just the word, placed between them like a stone. He turned to Lord Cresswell. Your accounts are fraudulent. Every debt levied on this household in the past 12 years has been fabricated or inflated. I have seen it from the servant's perspective. A pause. Which is the perspective you ensured I would never have. Lord Cresswell had retrieved the ledger. His hands were steady. Agnes noted that, the steadiness of his hands, and understood that he was a man who had prepared for this possibility and decided it would not destroy him. My lord, his voice carried its usual patience. You have been sleeping in a stable. Whatever you believe you observed, Mrs. Pemberton. The housekeeper stepped forward from the back of the room. Agnes had not seen her there. She was carrying a leather satchel, worn at the clasp, the kind of bag that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. She set it on the table beside Lord Cresswell's ledger. She opened it and produced a stack of papers, dense with figures, annotated in a small, precise hand. 3 years of entries copied and marked and cross-referenced with a patience that made Agnes's chest ache. Mrs. Pemberton set them on the table. I have been waiting, she said, for someone with the authority to read these. She looked at the Vampire King, not at Lord Cresswell, not at the assembled room, at him. My lord. The two words carried 22 years of service in them. They carried 3 years of quiet, solitary evidence-gathering in rooms where she was not supposed to be, copying figures by candlelight after the household slept, waiting for a master who kept being absent, and an opportunity that kept not arriving. They carried the particular dignity of a woman who had decided, alone and without assistance, that she would be ready when the moment came. Lord Cresswell looked at the papers. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Calculation. He moved. He was faster than Agnes had accounted for. Faster than a man of his age and his careful stillness had any right to be. His hand closed around her wrist, and he pulled her backward, one arm sweeping her against him, his other hand settling at her throat. Not a blade. His fingers. Positioned with the precision of a man who understood that a hostage's value was in her visibility, not her damage. Agnes's feet dragged on the stone. She could not get purchase. His hand at her throat was not crushing. It was worse than crushing. It was measured. Enough pressure to make each breath a negotiation, to ensure thus that every person in the room could see exactly how much air she was or was not receiving. She grabbed at his forearm with both hands and found nothing to grip, the fabric of his sleeve smooth and unyielding. You have been sleeping in a stable for a week, my lord. Lord Cresswell's voice had not changed. Still patient, still precise. He was backing toward the servant's door, and Agnes's heels were dragging furrows in the stone. You are in no position to release her. The Vampire King's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The shadows at his feet erupted. Not the controlled gathering she had watched in the stable, not the measured pooling of a man performing stillness. Raw, uncontained. Black across the floor like water breaking from a dam, spreading toward every corner of the room simultaneously, and the candles went out entirely, and the cold became absolute. and in the dark Agnes could see his eyes burning crimson like two coals in the center of something vast and very old and entirely without patience. Her wrist burned, not Cresswell's grip, something inside, something at the bone, moving outward through the layers of her, through the cracked skin and the cold water damage and the 18 years of scrubbing floors in other people's houses. A heat that reversed the direction of every cold thing she had ever known, moving from the center outward, insistent and entirely without her permission. Silver light leaked from beneath her skin. She gasped. Her own hands, pressed against Cresswell's forearm, were glowing. Faintly. Then not faintly. A pale silver radiance that had no source she could identify, coming from inside her the way warmth comes from inside a coal. Not reflected, not borrowed, generated. Cresswell felt it before he saw it. His grip changed. The measured pressure became something else. Something with the texture of a man who has just put his hand on a surface he did not expect to be hot. He looked down at her wrists. His face went the color of the papers on the table. Agnes's eyes changed. She could not see it. She felt it. A pressure behind her eyes. A shift in the quality of the light. The room suddenly sharper and deeper and more present than it had any right to be. She did not know what her eyes were doing. She knew what Cresswell's face was doing. She knew what Mrs. Pemberton's face was doing, across the room, the housekeeper's sharp eyes gone wide with something that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but occupied the space between them. She knew what the Vampire King's face was doing. He had gone very still. The shadows held their position. His crimson eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had no name for. Recognition, she thought. The way a door shifts on hinges that have been closed for a long time. Cresswell dropped her. He stumbled backward. His shoulder hit the doorframe, and he caught himself, but his hands were shaking now, the steadiness gone, and he was staring at Agnes with the expression of a man who has spent 12 years being the most dangerous thing in a room and has just discovered he was wrong. Agnes fell. Her knees hit the stone floor. Her hands went flat against it. The scrubbing position, the only position her body knew how to hold when everything was breaking at once. She pressed her palms into the cold stone and worked them against the surface. The familiar friction of grit and mortar under her cracked skin, back and forth, until her breathing found something to follow. The silver light at her wrists faded, slowly, like a coal going dark at the edges, while the center still held heat. She did not know what had happened. She did not know what she was. The guards came through the far door. She heard them before she saw them, boots on stone, the particular efficiency of men who had been waiting for a signal. They had Cresswell before he reached the corridor. He did not fight them. His face was chalk. His hands were still shaking. The room was very quiet. The Vampire King knelt. He did it slowly, deliberately, until his face was level with hers, there on the floor, and his crimson eyes were shifting back toward amber at the edges, the red retreating like a tide. He did not touch her. He held himself 2 feet away, in the careful, deliberate distance she recognized from the stable, the distance that felt chosen rather than accidental. He said quietly, "For her, not for the room. You carry the blood of the Ashenmore line, a vampire house destroyed 300 years ago. Your parents hid you to keep you alive." Agnes looked at her hands on the stone, the hands that had scrubbed floors since she was 8 years old, the hands that had broken bread in the dark for a man she thought was starving, the hands that had just produced light from inside her own skin without her knowledge or consent. I am a scullery maid, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile. The same one from the stable, when she told him hunger was not a luxury she could afford. You were, he said. Mrs. Pemberton appeared at Agnes's side. She did not ask permission. She took Agnes's arm with both hands, the grip of a woman who has helped people to their feet before and knows that the important thing is not to let them refuse. She pulled Agnes upright with the steady, unsentimental efficiency of 22 years of managing a household that required someone to manage it. She looked at the vampire king, not at Agnes. If you intend to explain, she said, I suggest you do it somewhere that does not have an audience of 40 servants who have not eaten breakfast. She steered Agnes toward the corridor door. My lord. Agnes moved because Mrs. Pemberton was moving her. Her feet found the floor. One step, another. Edwin was in the corridor. He had been there the whole time, she understood. Outside the door. Close enough to hear. Far enough to be safe. He took her other arm without speaking. His face was the face of someone who has just watched something he cannot yet put into words. And he held her arm the way he had held her hand at 8 years old, the night they understood they were alone. They walked. Mrs. Pemberton on one side, Edwin on the other. Agnes between them, with the silver light still fading from her skin in slow, diminishing pulses, her hand raw against the air, her knees aching from the stone. Behind her, she heard the vampire king rise. She did not look back. The corridor stretched ahead, long and cold, and lit by wall sconces that cast more shadow than light, and Agnes walked through it with no name for what she carried inside her skin, and the light at her wrists faded to nothing, and then it was only her hands in the dark, cracked and bleeding at the knuckles, the same hands they had always been, except that they were not. The room they had given her was on the 2nd floor, above the kitchens. It was warm. That was the first thing wrong with it. Agnes sat on the floor beside the bed, her back against the frame, her hands flat on the rug. The rug was thick. She pressed her palms into it anyway, working the fibers under her cracked skin, back and forth, the familiar friction finding nothing useful to follow. The tea on the nightstand had gone cold. She had not touched it. Edwin was in the kitchen, fed, safe. That fact held. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the chair by the window with the particular stillness of a woman who has waited out worse silences than this one. She did not offer more tea. She did not suggest Agnes take the bed. She looked out the window at the gray morning sky, and then she said, without preamble, Your mother's name was Alara Ashenmore. Your father was Connell. Agnes looked at her hands. The Ashenmore were a vampire house. Old, powerful, destroyed in 1723 by a faction that wanted their bloodline's gift for themselves. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was the same voice she used to recite household accounts, precise without ornament. The gift was this. Ashenmore vampires could see truth, not as a figure of speech, literally. Lies showed in the blood. Fraud showed in the skin. Corruption was visible to them the way color is visible to the rest of us. Agnes turned her hands over. The palms, the knuckles, the places where the lie had eaten the skin down to something raw and permanent. Your parents hid you among humans, changed your name, raised you without the blood knowledge, because they believed invisibility would keep you alive. It nearly did not, Agnes said. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth tightened. No, it nearly did not. A pause, measured and deliberate. Lord Vane knew what the Ashenmore were. When the anonymous letters about Cresswell's fraud arrived, he came to investigate himself, disguised. The beggar was never about testing the household, Agnes. He was testing whether the corruption was real, whether the accounts matched what he was being told. She looked at her then, directly. You were never part of the plan. Agnes pressed her palms harder into the rug. And yet, here I am. And yet, here you are. The fire in the small grate shifted. Agnes watched it. She thought about the stable, the cold, the particular quality of silence that had surrounded Thomas, who was not Thomas, when he sat with his back against the stall door and asked her questions about hunger with amber eyes that held too much patience for a man who claimed to have nothing. She had thought she was the one doing the seeing. She had been the one being seen. The great hall was warm by evening, beeswax and old wood, and the fire built high. Agnes came because Mrs. Pemberton had told her Lord Vane wished to speak with her, and because refusal would have required more energy than she had left to spend. She stood just inside the door. He was at the fireplace, his back to her, and he turned when she entered with the unhurried certainty of a man who had heard her footsteps from the corridor. His amber eyes were steady. The shadows at his feet were still. Agnes opened her mouth. The first word cracked, and she did not repair it. You sat in that stable, and you let me pity you. Her voice was uneven, and she let it be uneven. You let me give you bread I could not spare. You asked me questions about my own suffering, as though you were a stranger learning it for the first time, and the entire time you were the reason I was suffering in the first place. Her eyes burned. She turned toward the window. The old instinct, face away, hide the brake, and stopped herself. She turned back. The tears were on her face, and she did not wipe them. I have spent my entire life being invisible. Invisible is safe. Invisible means Edwin eats. And now you are telling me I was never invisible at all. That I am something. That my blood is something. Her voice steadied on anger and then lost it again, because anger was not what was underneath. That the bread I shared in a stable was some kind of test I did not know I was taking. He did not move toward her. He held himself still, the careful, deliberate distance she recognized from the stable, the distance that felt chosen. It was not a test. His voice dropped to something quiet and stripped of ceremony. It was a gift, and I was not worthy of it. I know that. A pause. I cannot undo the lie. I can tell you that the beggar who sat in your stable and ate your bread was closer to the truth of me than the vampire king who stands in this hall. Agnes looked at him. The fire moved behind him. His face held no performance, no title, nothing arranged for an audience. She thought about the bread, the weight of it in her hands, the choice that had not felt like a choice at all, because some things simply are what they are, and a man sitting cold in the dark is a man sitting cold in the dark regardless of what he carries underneath. She did not forgive him with words. She did not have words for it yet. But she stayed. The morning came gray and cold, and the great hall filled before the light had properly settled. Every servant, every tenant from the surrounding grounds, every official who had received a summons and understood that a summons from the vampire king was not a request. Agnes stood at the edge of the room. She had not moved toward the center. She did not intend to. Lord Cresswell was not there. He had been removed in the night. She did not know the details and found she did not need them. His absence was its own kind of statement, the shape of a man pressed into the air where he used to stand. Lord Vane stood before the assembly. Mrs. Pemberton stood beside him, a leather satchel at her side, her expression the expression of a woman who has been carrying a weight for 3 years and has just been permitted to set it down. She had been copying those ledgers since before Agnes had arrived at Graymore Hall. She had been waiting for someone with the authority to act on them. She had waited 22 years for this household to be run properly. Her patience, Agnes thought, was a more formidable thing than any vampire bloodline. Lord Vane spoke. His voice carried without effort, the way cold air carries. This household has been governed by theft. Every debt levied by Lord Cresswell in the past 12 years is void. Every wage owed will be paid in full. Every account will be reviewed by Mrs. Pemberton, who has served this estate with more loyalty than the man I trusted to manage it. Mrs. Pemberton did not smile. She produced the satchel and set it on the table beside her with the quiet finality of a closing argument. Then Lord Vane looked at Agnes. 7 days ago, I walked this estate with nothing. No title, no name, no authority. I was hungry. I was cold. I asked for shelter and was refused by every person in this household except one. The room turned. 40 faces found her at the edge of the hall. She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She had spent 3 years being looked through, and she understood now that looking through a person required their cooperation. And she was done cooperating. Agnes Whitmore gave me her last bread. She did not know who I was. She did not care who I was. She saw a man with nothing, and she shared what little she had. He said her name again. Agnes. Not the scullery girl. Not Whitmore's sister. Her name in full before the household that had looked past her for 3 years, in the hall where Lord Cresswell had called her a thief and smiled while he did it. The word carried across the stone floor and the high ceiling and the cold morning air, and landed somewhere in her chest that had been braced for a long time. Edwin was near the kitchen door. She could see him from where she stood. His face was the face of someone who has just watched his sister be seen, and his eyes were bright, and he was not trying to hide it. Agnes stood in the center of what had happened to her and let it be true. Later, the hall emptied by degrees. Mrs. Pemberton departed with the satchel and a brisk comment about breakfast not serving itself, revelations notwithstanding. Edwin went back to the kitchen laughing at something a footman had said, the laugh loose and unguarded, the laugh of a boy who has just learned he is not about to be turned out. Agnes walked the corridor alone. She passed the servants' entrance where the bailiff had stood 3 days ago, with his hand on Edwin's arm. She passed the linen cupboard, where she had hidden twice to avoid Lord Cresswell's rounds. She came to the scullery door. She stopped. The stone trough was visible through the gap. The scrubbing brushes hung on their hooks. The cold water smell of lye and iron and winter mornings before the rest of the house woke. 3 years of her hands in that trough, working the grit and the cold, until her knuckles bled, and her breathing steadied, and the day became survivable. She looked at it. She did not go in. Lord Vane was beside her. She had not heard him arrive. She never did. His hand found hers. Cold and still, the way stone is still, the way old things are still. She looked down at their joined hands, hers cracked and red at the knuckles, mapped with the evidence of every floor she had ever scrubbed, every pot she had ever lifted. Every morning she had knelt in freezing water to keep herself and Edwin fed. His pale and motionless beside them. The space between them did not feel like a chasm. I may still scrub, she said. I was good at it. You were, he said. A pause. The corridor held it. You were also the only person in this house who saw a stranger and chose to share rather than look away. That is not a scrubbing skill, Agnes. She almost smiled. Almost. It is, actually. Scrubbing teaches you that clean things are worth the effort. The seal at his wrist pulsed warm. A slow, deep beat, like something that had been waiting a long time to be still. At her own wrist, barely visible in the morning light coming through the high corridor windows, silver answered. Faint. Steady. Not a flare. Not a warning. Just a presence, quiet as breath, quiet as the space between one heartbeat and the next. The scullery door was behind her. The light came through the windows and touched the stone floor and the old wood and the joined hands of a scullery maid and a vampire king standing in a corridor that smelled of beeswax and cold air and the particular silence of a morning that has decided to begin.